Well, welcome everyone to the January 27th Environmental Board meeting. I'm calling this meeting to order. I am also serving as the duties for chair for this evening before we do the election of the chair, which is coming up on the agenda this evening. So excited to get that process rolling. So I just have a couple announcements here. So due to the virtual format of today's meeting, I'd like to start by providing some guidelines. We do have some participants attending both by phone and video. So for all meeting attendees, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name before each time you're speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking. And use the call-in information in the meeting invite if you're having any technical difficulties at all. And that reminds me that I did not introduce myself. So I'm Megan Curtis Murphy. I am serving as a staff liaison to the board, and I'm the Senior Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Issaquah. So I'd like to now go ahead and take roll. So I will go ahead and call everyone by alphabetical order. So please unmute yourself and say here when I call your name. First, we have Tom Anderson.
Here.
Surya Bolapragada.
Here.
Nancy Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Finch.
Here.
And please remember to mute yourself after you have spoken. Thank you. Cameron Fisher.
Yeah.
Rishi Hazra.
Here.
Thank you. Dan Hintz.
Here.
And I do not see Laura Labico yet, unless if she is on the other caller.
I'm here. I'm on the MacBook Air.
Yes, I see you. Thank you. That's what roll call's for. Danny Madden.
Here.
Don McWilliams.
Yeah, here.
Ann Newcomb.
Here.
And Janet Wall. Yep, Janet, are you able to unmute yourself there?
Finally. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, we have a full house again, so wonderful. So the first item on the agenda is approval of the January 13 minutes. So is there any objection to approval of the minutes? And hearing none, the minutes are approved for that meeting. We will now have an opportunity for public comment. So it's great that we have this. We'll have this on all of our agendas. So members of the public will be able to comment on the items before the board or other items that they have comments on. So for members of the public joining us, welcome. If you'd like to make comments, please press *3 on your phone and we'll call your name either by your name or the last 2 digits of the phone number when it's your turn to make comments. A few things to keep in mind when recognized. Please unmute your microphone. So *6 will probably be an option to do this. I will send you an unmute request first, and then you press *6, and then you unmute your phone. And I can review that again in a moment as we do each one. Also, please state your name, address, and relationship to the city, and speak clearly and pause frequently. And please limit comments to 5 minutes, and then remember to mute your microphone when you're done as well. If you do not respond after the name or phone number is called, or if your connection is lost unexpectedly, the meeting will need to proceed, but you're encouraged to rejoin the meeting as you are able. So we did have one person sign up to do comments this evening, so we'll go ahead and start with Ann Fletcher. So Ann, I will go ahead and request to unmute you now. And Ann, we don't hear you yet if you're talking. So you might have to press *6 and unmute your phone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great.
Great, thank you. I'm Ann Fletcher. I'm a resident of Issaquah and a member of People for Climate Action. I want to thank you, environmental board members, for your service to the community. And I want to give you best wishes for the productive work that you will do to protect the environment. I am in favor of Issaquah having a strong electric vehicle charging ordinance. This is supported by current city plans and policies. It is a first step to bring hope and motivate us to take other actions to get a jump start on addressing climate change. Electric vehicle readiness will encourage and meet the predicted demand. Electric cars plus less car driving go hand in hand to reduce our carbon emissions. Initial plans like this can be worked out simultaneously with updating Issaquah's plans, policies, and regulations over the next few years. The community and the council have requested action of this ordinance. The staff has done much research to bring this proposal to this point. I suggest 2 improvements to the proposed ordinance. Number 1, require electric vehicle charging ability in single-family, duplex, and townhome units rather than using incentives. Seattle already has this in their code, and let's resolve any further legal issues about it. Number 2, require electric vehicle charging ability in affordable housing units. Rather than discriminating on basic transportation needs, provide incentives and reduce the cost to affordable housing builders, such as reducing the number of total parking spaces required. My written comments include additional support for these statements, and I will end with a quote from Greta Thunberg. She encourages leaders in this way: "The one thing we need more than hope is action. Taking action unleashes hope." Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And do we have any other members of the public that would like to make comments? If you do, please press *3 on your phone now. I am not seeing anyone. I see the last 2 digits, 64. I'm just going to try to unmute you in case you did want to make comments. So I'll go ahead and request unmute now. And if so, you can press *6 on your phone and unmute. And I'm not hearing anyone. And not seeing anyone else that wants to make comments. So we will go ahead and move on with the agenda. So the next item on the agenda is the election of the chair and vice chair for the board. And they will be taking over the duties of chair. So I would like to go ahead and first call for nominations. We'll start with the chair position. So we'll go ahead and call for nominations. So would anyone like to let me know if they'd like to nominate someone to be the chair? And I see in the chat, Anne, could you unmute yourself? And we'll start with just the chair here.
Yes, I would like to nominate Nancy Davidson as chair. And thank you, Nancy, for volunteering for this position.
Great, thank you.
That.
And if there's anyone else that would like to make a nomination, you can indicate in the chat. Otherwise, we'll move on to the vice chair position. And I'm not seeing any other Any other nominations? So since there's been no other nominations, Nancy Davidson is now considered an elected chair by unanimous consent. So congratulations, Nancy, and thank you very much for taking on this role to lead the new board. We will now move on to the vice chair position. If anyone would like to nominate someone to be vice chair, you can go ahead and type it into the chat.
I'm just supposed to be calling.
I'm hearing a little bit background noise. And I see Ann Newcomb has mentioned someone for vice chair. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I would like to nominate Jamie Finch as vice chair. And thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. And is there anyone else that would like to make a nomination for the vice chair position? And I am not seeing any in chat. So Jamie Finch, congratulations. You've been elected to our vice chair position by unanimous consent. So congratulations to both of you. I heard the caller with the last two digits 64. So I want to go ahead and go back just to make sure we didn't miss anyone that wanted to make public comment. So the caller 64, I'm going to go ahead and request that you unmute yourself now. And you can press star. So you're now unmuted on our end. Did you want to make public comment?
No, I'm just here visiting. My name is Jerry Gordon, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. I'm Issaquah's climate guide, and I had decided that I would attend tonight's meeting to see how your board is operating and just be a part of your organization. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. I will go ahead and mute you now. All right, with that, we have our new chair and vice chair. So I had spoken with Nancy a little bit before, and she had generously offered to take over the duties of chair starting after this. So I will let her move us through the agenda with the next item, which will be myself. Nancy, is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
Well, I'm looking forward to working with all of you, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to chair this group. I think it'll be a fun working group. We have a lot of tough challenges ahead of us in terms of work plan that has been identified by the administration. So with that, given that we have a fairly vigorous agenda for tonight, I thought we'd move right into the next agenda item unless there's any objection. And with that, let's move into the electric vehicle charging ordinance. And we'd like to start it off with a presentation from Megan. And after that, just kind of laying this out so everyone knows. I don't know if Megan wants questions along the way, or if you want to wait till the end of the presentation. I think that's something when you unmute, Megan, you might want to point out how you want to receive questions. And then at that point, we will continue to ask questions until we get as many of our questions answered as we have time allotted, and then move on into kind of providing some kind of comments for the administration. Just a quick reminder to everyone on the board. I hope I'm not speaking too fast. We are doing this in a two-touch. We're getting 2 times to review this policy and ordinance. This one here is more, since we're a new board, this provides us an opportunity to hear what Megan has to say, kind of ask questions and provide a little bit of guidance and comments back to the City Council and to the Planning Policy Commission. And then at a subsequent yet to be determined date, which Megan may have more information, it'll be brought back to us to actually provide some motions when we get more feedback from the council and from the Planning Policy Commission. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
Great, thank you very much. To answer that question, I would prefer overall questions at the end. If there is a burning question along the way, feel free to indicate that in the chat though, and Nancy can keep her eye on it and let me know. So if there is anything along the way, I can answer that. So I will go ahead and share my screen here. Can I get just a thumbs up if people can see my screen? That's a lot of thumbs up. All right. All right, so good evening. So as I mentioned, I'm Megan Curtis Murphy, the Senior Sustainability Coordinator with the city. So tonight I'll be presenting about the proposed electric vehicle ordinance, or EV ordinance. This will require EV charging infrastructure in new multifamily and commercial buildings, as well as substantial retrofits. If passed, the new code language would reside in the city's land use code under the parking standards. The City Council had requested a draft ordinance to come before them earlier this month, and the Council has now requested feedback from the Planning Policy Commission and the Environmental Board. This evening, we're asking for input on the overall proposal to increase EV infrastructure in the city. However, there are also a few specific areas that we're looking for input on. Both the Council and the Planning Policy Commission discussed each of these items and requested feedback from the board. The first is the use of incentives to encourage electric vehicle readiness in single-family homes and townhomes. The second is the use of a waiver for affordable housing units so as not to add additional costs to these projects. And the third is whether transit-oriented development, or TOD projects, should be handled differently in the ordinance due to their proximity to transit. There were brief summaries of the conversations at the council meeting and the PPC meeting in the memo, as well as some additional information that was requested to help inform the discussion for this evening. First, I want to provide some background information on the city goals and plans that support increasing EV infrastructure in our city, as well as why we're discussing the proposal now. So back in 2014, Issaquah adopted greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Transportation makes up 38% of our community-wide emissions. So increasing EV ridership will help us move closer to our city's climate goals. The city's Sustainable Building Action Strategy is another plan that supports this ordinance. The goal of the strategy that was established by the City Council was to establish Issaquah as a regional leader in green building. This plan was adopted in 2017 and includes a strategy to update codes for electric vehicles. We also have the city's Mobility Master Plan, which includes a policy to help increase use of electric vehicles, which these new standards will help to do. And last, increasing EV infrastructure was identified as one of the priorities at the community convening on climate. And together with local organizations, we presented the recommendations from the convening during the October 19th council meeting. And at that meeting, council members requested that the proposal come to them before January. There was an overall feeling at the convening that we wanted to start with action. We'll be developing a climate action plan later, but there was a request to see actions straight away after that. So this was a response to that. Another reason why an EV ordinance is especially important for Issaquah right now is that King County is expected to experience rapid growth in EV ownership in the coming years. One reason for this is the Washington state passed a law in 2020 that will require automakers to sell a certain percentage of zero-emission vehicles each year. And a similar law is already on the books in California, which has the largest market share percentage of EVs in the country. Also, electric vehicles are expected to achieve price parity with gas vehicles as soon as 2023, and they're also cheaper to own and maintain than gas vehicles. But one factor that might inhibit growth is the lack of access to EV charging, which this ordinance will help to address. And the people most affected are those living in multifamily housing who can't just install the infrastructure needed to charge, so are more often excluded from the benefits of EV ownership. Before we get into the details of the proposal, I want to clarify some of the lingo around the various types of EV infrastructure. So this ordinance is looking at level 2 charging, which is the most common because it allows cars to charge faster than plugging into a standard outlet, but it's also less costly than level 3 fast charging. It requires a 240 volt circuit, which is the bigger outlet that's commonly used for dryers and households. And although you could charge using the common household outlet, it takes much longer time to do this, so it's not considered adequate for common electric vehicle usage. So the first type of charging is called EV capable. This means that there's electric panel capacity and space to support level 2 charging, but no outlet installed. And EV capable is not included in the proposal, as most EV codes have focused on, most of the recent EV codes have focused on the later two types of infrastructure, which actually makes it easier to get the cars plugged in. And the second type of EV infrastructure is called EV ready. So this is the designated parking space that's provided with the 240 volt dedicated circuit for the charging station. And EV ready is represented in the image on the slide here with the pink line that includes the plug point for the charger, but not the charging equipment itself. So in a house, someone could easily plug into this to charge as long as it's located near the designated parking area. But at an apartment building or a commercial lot, it would likely be covered up since it wouldn't be managed as a charging point. And finally, EVSE, or electric vehicle supply equipment, is the final part, which is the charging station itself, which allows cars to plug in. So there are many states and jurisdictions that have implemented EV codes already. Many are along the West Coast, with most in California. And one reason for this is likely the policy that I was discussing earlier that requires automakers to sell a certain percentage of electric vehicles each year. And again, this is the same policy that Washington State just adopted last year. And the codes themselves vary by various building types and type of EV infrastructure, as you can see on the slide here. So this slide shows the jurisdictions in Washington that currently have EV codes or are in the process of developing them. The Regional Code Collaboration, or the RCC, is a collection of jurisdictions around King County that work together to collect research and develop green codes. And last year, they developed an EV charging code through a large stakeholder process with jurisdictions, the EV industry, utilities, and interest groups. And the next steps for that ordinance is for cities like Issaquah to consider it and modify as needed for their individual jurisdictions. So the chart to the left shows the basics of the model RCC code. The proposed King County code is based on this, and each of the other jurisdictions have slightly different codes, but most are pretty similar to this one. Also, the cities of Bellevue, Kirkland, and Redmond all included the development of EV codes in their recent climate action plans and have expressed interest in using the RCC model for their own jurisdictions as well. Overall, the city's proposed ordinance is based on and is very similar to the Regional Code Collaboration's model code. The biggest difference is that the city's ordinance proposes an incentive for single-family and townhome charging rather than a requirement. So the administration is proposing the projects that install EV-ready infrastructure would receive a $350 incentive for each of their EV parking spaces installed. And from our research, this incentive would most likely cover the majority, if not all, of the expenses of EV-ready installation in these building types. And we'll look at the costs a bit more on a future slide. So the city is recommending an incentive rather than a requirement because of a state law which prevents cities from making amendments to the state building code that affect single-family residential construction, such as the EV code, without approval from the State Building Code Council. The state also recently adopted EV codes in the state building code. So since they're regulating them there, it's advised that the city does not impose the single family regulations through the land use code. So the administration is instead recommending incentives to increase the likelihood we get the EV ready construction in single family and townhome units. For the second piece, for affordable housing, the city's proposing waiving the EV infrastructure requirements for units at or below 80% of the area median income. So in other words, the number of affordable housing units does not need to be included in the calculation for EV parking spaces. And one of the reasons for this is that developing more affordable housing in Issaquah is a big priority for the city. So in the proposal, we didn't want to add any additional requirements or cost to these types of projects. And as we know, both the council and PPC has provided feedback on both of these components of the ordinance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So we'll now go ahead and look at the specific components of the Issaquah proposal. This first slide shows the proposed requirements for multifamily residential buildings. For all new construction of multifamily buildings, the proposed ordinance would require 10% of all parking spots have EVSE, or the complete charging infrastructure, and 30% of the parking spaces would have to be EV ready, meaning that they have the outlet or terminal available to easily install charging equipment. For all existing multifamily buildings undergoing substantial improvements or retrofits, 10% of parking spaces will have EVSE, which is the same as new construction, and then 20% of the spaces will need to be EV ready. And a substantial improvement is defined as any repair, reconstruction, or improvement of a structure where the cost is equal to or exceeds 50% of the actual cash or market value. Since most EV charging happens at home, the proposed ordinance places higher requirements on multifamily buildings than non-residential ones. So for non-residential, 5% of all parking spaces would need to have EVSE, and 10% of spaces would need to be EV ready. And these requirements apply to both the new construction and the substantial improvements. Then there's also the same requirement for any new paved surface parking lots and parking garages. And these are the same percentages that are in the Regional Code Collaborations Model Ordinance. So here is a table with cost estimates of the various types of EV infrastructure. The cost for EV capable, EV ready, and EVSE are in the first 3 columns, with the total cost in the 4th column. The last column here shows the estimated cost for retrofitting. So these costs were developed by King County through research and consultation. And since presenting these, I've heard from some that they are about right, and then I've heard from others that they seem a bit low. So this is probably because costs will really vary depending on building type, charger type, whether it's new construction or retrofit. So there's a lot of factors going into them. But something that's important to note, I think, is that EV readiness retrofits cost 2 to 8 times more than EV ready construction, which is due to several factors. Some of those being if you need to break and repair walls, if you need to upgrade electric service panels, if you need to break and then repair parking surfaces. There's also various methods for installing conduit. And then there's also the additional permitting and inspection costs associated with the retrofits. So overall, that's why it's important to install EV infrastructure when a building is first built.
And is that, for that slide, is that the apartment cost, is that per apartment building, or that's just per spot?
This is per spot, per parking space. And as I mentioned earlier, we had an initial conversation with the City Council about this on January 12th and the Planning Policy Commission on the 14th. So there was a lot of discussion, particularly around the 3 items I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. The first was on single-family requirements versus incentives. Since the majority of people charge their vehicles at home, there was concern that we wouldn't be getting enough and adequate EV infrastructure at home without making this a requirement. And there was also discussion about whether providing incentives to single-family units was the best use of the money, since it's a relatively small cost to make these units EV ready. Also, the owners of single-family homes would likely have more resources to add it in themselves compared with other types and other needs, including affordable housing. Another point was that developers should already be doing this and not getting added incentives to do this as a low cost, because it's a low-cost item. And I already touched on the reason why the city proposed incentives rather than requirements, but I'm happy to discuss that more if questions arise about it. Oh, sorry, I'm going to stay on this slide. So the next point of discussion was on the proposed waiver for affordable housing. So the discussion about this item was mainly about the cost of building affordable housing, balanced with the equity concern of excluding residents from the benefits of EV ownership. The council and PPC both requested additional information on this, some of which was provided in the memo, including examples of how other jurisdictions have approached it. I also provide some information on the overall cost of parking and the additional cost of EV infrastructure, as well as a perspective from the affordable housing community itself. The last main item of discussion was about wanting to look more closely at how the proposal should treat TOD projects. So during the public comments at the council meeting, we heard from a developer that they had concerns about added cost to projects, and he expressed that the the parking is already expensive and the project is close to transit, so he didn't want to add more costs with EV infrastructure. The Planning Policy Commission also reviewed the ordinance, so they made many of the same points as the City Council on both single-family requirements and affordable housing. There was also more discussion from PPC about the best use of incentives and whether they should be used for other purposes rather than single family. And one PPC commissioner was particularly interested in the environmental board's perspective on the use of incentives versus requirements for EV charging in general. The PPC also discussed TOD a bit more. Projects located near transit are already allowed to build less parking since they are encouraging the use of transit rather than personal vehicles. However, many residents do still own a personal vehicle, and not having access to chargers would likely prohibit them from choosing an electric vehicle, many of which have ranges of 250 miles or more. As I mentioned, there were requests for more information on what other jurisdictions are doing on affordable housing, as well as costs and parking, which were provided in the memo. And last, there was a discussion about EV-capable infrastructure. So remember, this would provide space and capacity for chargers, as well as the conduit, but no wiring. And the wiring itself is more expensive, so it would be another barrier to actually getting the chargers in place. Overall, I found that in the literature of the codes, EV capable was more common several years ago when EV codes were first being developed, when they were focusing more on planning and design. But now, most recently, the majority of codes are focusing on EV ready or EVSE, which is what the regional code collaboration found as well. So they left EV capable out of their model ordinance. So here's a timeline showing the path thus far for the EV proposal and the next steps in the process. So we'll be returning to council study session on February 9th, and we'll bring back the additional information that was included in the memo, as well as the feedback from the environmental board that we get tonight and PPC. This will help inform overall next steps for the proposal. And we'll be looking for council direction on those next steps in process. So as Nancy mentioned at the beginning, we do want this to be a two-touch so that we have an opportunity to get more into questions and discussions tonight. We just don't have the future dates for those next meetings on it yet. And so when we originally sent out the packet, we had included the environmental board recommendation report, but as I was just mentioning, overall, this will be a two-step process, so we won't be filling this out tonight, but I think it's a good chance to kind of talk about it and preview what the next meetings will be. So this is what the recommendation report will look like. And overall, there'll be an opportunity at future meetings to have an opportunity to have discussion about the types of recommendations that the board wants to be making. Those would be made through a motion, which would then be discussed through the board and then voted on. And each of those items would either be included in this recommendation report or not, depending on that vote. And then there would also be an overall vote from the board about which action to take to recommend the proposal as presented, do not recommend it, and providing the reasons for that, or to recommend it with the changes through the motions that the board talks about. So the last slide here is just a reminder on the feedback being requested for this evening. We are looking for feedback on the overall proposal, but also the pieces that Council and PPC were specifically looking for feedback on as well, about the single family incentives, the affordable housing waiver, and then the TOD projects. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I will hand it back to Nancy.
Thank you, Megan. That was a great presentation. At this point, like to open this up for questions from the board. And if you have a question, please identify it in the chat message bar. And I'm sure Megan will get on to address them. And I'd like to try and make sure that we have enough time to give any comments at the end, but this is really focused on questions for Megan as she has done her work. So with that, I'm open. Anybody have any questions? Okay, I see that Rishi has one. Go ahead, Rishi.
Yes, I'm curious how requiring EV-ready or EVSE capabilities in affordable housing will affect the prices of the affordable homes themselves, or is that just for developer costs?
That is a good question. From my understanding, it's more for the developer, so they have to pay for the parking and the added infrastructure for that on the pieces that they're doing. But as far as I know, it wouldn't change the cost of the actual housing itself.
Okay, our next question is from Dawn. Dawn, you there? Might want to unmute, Dawn.
Sorry, my button wasn't working. I kept clicking it and it wasn't doing anything.
I understand. Hey, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. I get it.
Mine's also on affordable housing, Megan. You mentioned in there that with the affordable housing waiver that the developer got to reduce the amount of parking spaces, something along those lines. Can you go back to that a little bit?
Sure. So the affordable housing waiver, it doesn't change the number of parking spots. So through the land use code, all projects are required to have a minimum and maximum parking. So this does not change that. What it changes is that the waiver itself would say that if for however many units of affordable housing they have, they wouldn't need to do the infrastructure for that. So for example, if they're building a project that is all affordable housing units, there would be no EV infrastructure included with the waiver. However, if they were building a building that had both market rate and affordable housing units, then they would be doing EV infrastructure based on the percentages of parking spaces that are associated with the market rate units, but not the affordable housing units.
Okay, and follow up to that, do you have buildings in Issaquah? I'm not that familiar with the affordable housing in Issaquah. Do you have dedicated buildings for affordable housing, or are most of them incorporated into other residentials?
There are several that are all affordable housing now, but this wouldn't affect those unless if there was that substantial retrofit or substantial improvement. What we're seeing a lot of going forward is in the valley floor, which is where we're going to be focusing a lot of the development coming forward. Depending on where you build in the valley floor, there's certain requirements to have affordable housing units. So that ranges if you're building an overall market rate building. Depending on where it's located, you'd be required to have, I think, between about 7.5% to 15% affordable housing units in that building. So then that's where the waiver would come into play.
Okay, thank you.
Jamie, you're up next.
Thank you, Megan. One question I had was, obviously everything here is focused on either new construction or substantial retrofits or substantial improvements. Is there any plans, or is there a specific reason that anything related to like a retrofit in an existing structure was not included in this ordinance proposal?
So With the proposal, if there's a substantial retrofit to a project, then it would be included. And depending if it's residential or commercial, the percentages change for that. But overall, it's less than if it was built new. Is that answering your question?
Sort of. I mean, I'm just like, obviously most of the houses that are going to be, or the structures that are going to be in Issaquah for the foreseeable future exist today versus are going to be built. So I'm just curious, like around is it a future focus to look at the existing structures, or is that something that we just think is too difficult a problem to try to address today?
Got it. Yeah, so I agree that a lot of the buildings are already built now. And so that is one of the reasons why we think this ordinance is so important to have, particularly the fact that it includes commercial development as well. So, for example, if someone is living in an apartment building now that doesn't have access to charging stations, by getting more infrastructure out there, some that are at commercial developments and public parking lots, they might have the option of doing that. We don't have anything in mind to go back and start requiring it in current buildings. There could be incentives in the future. For example, Puget Sound Energy, they've had some projects before where they're looking at some existing buildings to set up chargers. There might be incentives for building owners to do it, but we don't have any specific plans to require that in existing buildings.
Okay, and I do have one more question if I have time. Is that all right?
Go ahead, Jamie.
Okay. The other question was, I know what was proposed was an incentive for single family. Is there any possible strategy that would involve like the opposite, so a disincentive to not have it in the fees that are charged or whatever it might be?
From my understanding, that would get into a little bit more of the requirement side of it. So if we are having a penalty for not having it, that would be too similar to having the requirement, which wouldn't be advised by the city to have that.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, you're up next.
Hi. Have we talked at all with developers of affordable housing and gotten their direct feedback on anything about this?
Yeah, so I've reached out to a couple. I've heard back from one, and they overall felt that agreed that electric vehicles are coming and that it's important to have the infrastructure. There was concern about cost, but the biggest concern they expressed to me was actually installing the infrastructure. They were more amenable to having EV ready in affordable housing rather than actually putting in the chargers.
So EV ready was easier to accommodate than actually installing.
Exactly. So kind of in the line of infrastructure, there's EV capable first, which is the farthest from actually being able to charge. EV ready has the actual plug point that you could plug into. Usually that would be covered up unless if there's a charging port, just because a manager of a building would want to charge for it if they were going to have it. But having it EV ready allows them to just at a future date add the chargers themselves. But there is that cost difference between EV ready and EVSE, the charging infrastructure. So this developer that I spoke to preferred EV ready rather than having the additional requirement to also have the EVSE.
Thank you. And I have like a million questions, but I'm trying to be filtering them. I had asked you before, maybe I'll save my question and come back, but I do have more questions. Well, I'll jump into it because I'm interrupting myself. I think something that's concerning me is the presumption that this is going to be reducing fossil fuel usage. And I appreciate that we're planning for the future, but 40% of Issaquah's fuel, as we were researching earlier today, like 40% is coal-based. So, and then we don't have a lot of new developments coming in. I don't want to give the illusion of us being extremely progressive when the reality is this isn't going to affect a lot of things. So I'm curious about like the infrastructure needs I had asked for, but if we could get information, I'd be curious just on how much more power that might require, if anything, to different houses. I'm guessing not a lot because it seems like a pretty low voltage, but you know, if we're going to be putting up more power, any sort of power lines or anything like that, I'd be interested in the impact of that as well.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit, and then you can let me know if there's more information that's needed. So overall, kind of the first point about reducing emissions, the electric vehicles are, or let me back up for a minute. So I think the first piece is that with PSE's fuel mix, they are planning to have a lot more electric vehicles come online. They have a draft transportation electrification plan right now. And in that, they had a survey where they surveyed customers, and 68% of them said that they expect to own or lease an electric vehicle in the future. So they are currently planning for that. Also through the legislation that was passed last year that requires the Clean Electricity Transformation Act, that requires a clean electricity supply for all utilities in Washington. So that's a phased approach. Part of that phasing is that by 2025, coal will be required to be out of the fuel mix. So you mentioned that PSE's fuel mix is about 40% coal right now, so they are currently planning to get that out of their fuel mix because of Washington state law. And then by 2045, they are all required to have clean electricity, so 100% renewable electricity by 2045. So we are planning, as we get more electric vehicles, the electricity supply for that will be a lot cleaner than what is currently with gas vehicles.
So you said thank you, that's very helpful. You said the first one was 2025 to be out of coal?
Correct.
That's ambitious. And that's a statewide mandate that they're under?
Yes, so that's called the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA, which was passed in I'm forgetting if it's 2019 or 2020. But so the utilities are all currently working towards that and planning for that.
On a follow-up for that, I noticed on their website that they that you can opt in to like a greener energy versus the not opting in. Is that relevant to this, or maybe less so given that it's headed that direction?
I think residents have the option to purchase green power through the green power program that they have. So that's something that residents can do.
Okay, I'm going to move on now. Danny, you had a question?
Yeah, hi. I was curious about the city's recommendation for doing incentives rather than a requirement. So my understanding is this would be in the land use code, but and I think you mentioned that the state law was only prohibiting changes to the building code. So I was just curious as to why the recommendation was incentives.
Yes. So yes, in order to make changes to the single family building code, you would need to go before the State Building Code Council. You said that this is in the land use code, which is correct. However, through the newest state energy code, they have put in electric vehicle requirements into the building code. So even though we're able to require zoning and parking standards in the land use code, it could possibly be seen as going around that state requirement that you can't modify the single family building code, since now the state is saying that EV infrastructure is being mandated through the building code. So it's a little bit about where the code is, what the intent of it is. And and with that, I am not a full lawyer. I have been consulting with our attorney on this, and he is going to be attending the council study session on February 9th to kind of get into the further intricacies of that, because I know it's something that's come up in each of the meetings. So I think he might be able to address that a little bit better, but hopefully I was able to explain that a little bit here.
Okay, yeah, understood. Thank you. Also, I wanted to ask about affordable housing. So you mentioned that there is a waiver, but also is affordable housing, would the incentives also be available to affordable housing developers?
Yes, they would. So for single family affordable housing units or townhomes is probably more likely, then they would be able to take advantage of that incentive program.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm going to step in and just ask a question to follow on to Danny's real quick. And that is, have we approached the State Building Council in terms of what they might consider in terms of requiring EV charging stations? And if that might be on their agenda or something they might be willing to have a conversation about, given all of the need to get away from some of these other energy sources?
I have not contacted them directly, but I've talked to several people at King County and City of Seattle that have, and overall, it's generally a time-consuming process, but also an uphill battle a little bit to get something like this to go through the State Building Code Council. Often these types of proposals do not pass through. The State Building Code Council is not just King County, it's the full state. So it's representing building interests from across the state. So often these single family type of programs do not get through.
Thank you. Anne, go ahead. I apologize for interrupting in front of you. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, at first I just want to add one more thing about CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act. I work really closely with the IRP that PSC is doing for their 2021 IRP, and they will be required to meet all the goals. And the middle part that we didn't mention is by 2030, they'll need to be carbon neutral, which means they can still have 20% of, say, natural gas, but they'll have to pay offsets for that. So it is looking good, and I think this is just part of the plan as we move forward to reduce our carbon footprint. And then I wanted to also mention, so with the homes and apartments and townhomes that are next to transit, have we considered that a lot of people who take transit are actually people who think, my experience is they're people who think more, they're environmentally minded, and so they might be even more apt to get an electric car. So I think if we could have some requirements for them as well, I think that would be good. And then for the affordable housing, I think at the very least, it would be great to have the EV ready. And then I also have a question about how will they be paying for it? Will they need to insert, like if you're in an apartment, will they need to insert a card and pay for it with a credit card or a little card that they have, a charging card that's prepaid? Do we know how that's going to work?
So that would be up to the building owner and operator themselves. Often people will have, if they have an electric card, they'll have an account with whichever charger they're using most frequently. But there's various charging, either by session, by hour, but that would be up to the building operator.
Cool. And then I think this is really awesome. And then the more that are at home and to make it convenient is really great. But then also having it so that people can charge, keep it plugged in, even at apartment houses. So it's good that there's going to be a lot of them. I'm just wondering if there are enough spaces, like it sounds like there will be, at least for a while, if they can be plugged in, and then some people will want to opt out to get a refund on their electric bill, and eventually they'll be using the batteries to feed into the grid when the grid needs energy, and then charge the car when they need to. And then plus you can program it to charge it at night when the grid has more energy to be used. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't too much talking rather than questions.
And that's what I was going to try and remind everyone on the board. Want to stay focused on questions right now, and then we'll have a time for comments. And so I'm going to try and move us through our questions so that we have time to provide feedback to Megan and to the council along the way. So with that, I see that Laura, and if we could stay with questions, and then we'll come back and have another round for comments, please.
I had a question about the EV ready. How is that going to be phased in? Like, the context I'm asking about is, how do we know that if we asked for a bunch of spots, like that they'll ever turn into actual EV spaces? Is that going to be zoned or planned for at all? Do you know?
That is not part of the requirement. The EV ready is really to make sure, as we're seeing more electric vehicles come on, as the demand is coming up, we have that infrastructure in place to easily put in the charger. So if there's a larger multifamily building and the spots are getting filled up and they're hearing from people who want to buy electric cars, it would be a lot easier for them to put in that infrastructure.
Okay, the next question is from Jamie. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there was EV requirements being added to the state building code. Is that accurate? Can you share anything about what those look like?
Yes, I don't quite have it memorized or in front of me, but they're fairly minimal, but they require either for buildings to put in infrastructure, which they classify a little bit differently, either just space and capacity for chargers later, not even EV ready. They require you to either do a certain percent that they're just building in the space, or you can put in the EV chargers themselves. So the way I describe it, it's a pretty big or there about you could either just build in that capacity or actually have the chargers. So it's up to the building owners themselves, and the percentages is lower for that, 5% of spots.
Okay. And that's multifamily, or is that all across all building types, or is that?
That is multifamily and commercial.
Okay. So none of that is relevant to single family?
Correct, right. So the building code is,
yeah.
Yeah.
And then one other question. Because the incentive is coming from a reduction of permit fees for building, correct? Do you know how the like per unit cost for multifamily for a building permit relative to a permit for a single family? Like trying to get a sense for like how much money per unit is there to work with in that fee that's paid?
That is a great question that I do not know the answer to. So I can put that on a list for follow-up.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, I see you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Dan here. Megan, I think this is kind of building on Don's question earlier, but I was kind of revisiting the memo here about the City of Seattle's ordinance and affordable housing, and actually working, but still enforcing still requiring the EV ready spots. I guess I didn't quite feel like I got a satisfying answer, or maybe I kind of missed that, but is that something that's being considered in terms of possibly requiring less overall parking, but still requiring the EV ready spots? And I guess just a higher level question, do you think there's any way this incentivizes or disincentivizes more parking, more impervious surfaces? This is kind of getting at more of a comment and opinion on where I stand on that, where I think it's a little unnecessary, but I don't know if you feel like that sways one way or another.
Let's see. I think you or I cut out for a second there, but I believe I understand the question. So, looking at what if City Seattle did, so they reduced parking for affordable housing in general. In Issaquah, we don't have that right now because just where we are with the city and development, it's still fairly car dependent. So we don't have that as an option to reduce overall parking. So that was just kind of taking a look at another city and how they've incorporated, meaning that cities can make different decisions about how they want to treat affordable housing and these types of requirements. Did that answer your question?
I guess I'm still unmuted, sorry. That answers the question specifically around the trade-offs there. And I guess high level, yeah, maybe I'll say this for the comment part of our discussion.
I don't know if y'all noticed I left for a while. We lost our internet for a second. So, if that happens, I hope Jamie steps in or Megan until I figure it out. My apologies to everyone. Let me pull up the chat bar again. If someone else wanted to chat, I lost it all. So I'm going to ask Megan to call on people that are on the chat side that have questions. And I'd like to try and get us wrapped up, at least on the question part of this, in about 10 minutes. So my apologies, I can't see who put in for a chat.
And I believe Rishi is next.
Yeah, I had a question on the third piece of feedback requested, and that was around whether transit or TOD projects. And if I'm correct, is that transit-oriented development? And I was wondering how that, if there's a specific example of that in the ordinance itself, and like what they're asking for feedback on in terms of that.
Yes, so there's nothing about transit-oriented development in the ordinance as it's written. So that came up at the council meeting. I think one of the reasons is because we had a developer who's working on a TOD project to put it in near the Issaquah Transit Center. He called in and provided comments that he was concerned about the added costs for these types of projects. So he'd mentioned that since it's so close to transit, people may not want to. We're focusing more on getting people into transportation rather than the kind of the different cars that they are driving. So that's why it came up as one of those topics of conversation, and council members were wondering if it should be included in the ordinance at all. Saria.
Hi, this is just a clarifying question, but there wasn't too much about single family homes. So is it like assumed that majority of the single family homes in Issaquah are already EV ready, including houses built like before 2000? And is that why single family homes weren't really like mentioned too much on this presentation?
I don't think most have been built EV ready. The ones that we have in the city, I think so. If you're in a single family home, you might have access to an outdoor plug point, a normal charge. So someone could charge their vehicle through that. Not everyone has access to that. It could be slow. They might run a cord through a window. They might try to find a different port, but most probably don't have access to that 240 volt plug. I think overall in Issaquah, we're expecting to have more development that is going to be multifamily and commercial, and as well as townhomes, but less likely to see as many single family homes just because of the land capacities that we have. But I think overall, it might have been mentioned less because we were having the single family incentive rather than the requirement. I believe Danny's next.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit earlier that a lot of these types of proposals don't, or sometimes don't pass the state council. I was just wondering, like what generally the process would look like if we did want to, propose to the state council and, like impose requirements and, like how we would navigate that.
Yes, thank you. I have been inquiring about that a little bit myself. Overall, to go through the State Building Code Council, you would need to get their permission to have an amendment. And the amendment would need to state why there's something special or unusual about the city that would require a departure from state code. And then the State Building Code would consider whether that is a reason that they want to take up, and then it would be a process to figure out when they want to hear it. And they do meet monthly, but it's not sure when they would be able to meet on that. But overall, there would be probably several meetings on it. And through some others' experiences I've talked to with Seattle and King County, items like that have been denied in the past. So that is kind of my anecdotal stories from others I've heard that have gone through the process. And it looks like we have two more questions. So Jamie, he's actually having connectivity issues. That's not a question.
I think I had the same connectivity issues that Nancy had, so that wasn't a question.
Okay. So it looks like the last question I'm seeing is from the chat box is Laura.
Hi, one last question. Since I know that the city will be working on zoning and planning updates, how does this fit in at all with the bigger picture of that effort, or is that not relevant right now?
No, I think that's relevant. So that the city had the climate convening and various plans where we've been looking to bring EV policy forward. So that's the reason why we're talking about it now. Also, at the same time, the city does have plans and is currently working on doing the land use code update. That will be a longer process, most likely, that this board will be heavily involved in, and there'll be several aspects to that. But this was pulled out as an item that would be important to be considered due to the community convening on climate, where it was really asked to start doing action. We also have plans to do a climate action plan, but there was a request to start doing actions rather than just planning. So that's why we're talking about moving this forward. It looks like Nancy had a question.
So has there been any consideration by the city and the coalition that it's working with to run a legislative proposal to try and address mandating EV capable in or EV ready in single family homes instead of going through the building council?
We have not discussed that yet. I think because some cities have already been passing codes, there is a desire to work through the regional code collaboration to get cities on board to do that. But no, I haven't talked to them about any sort of legislative proposal.
Okay, I think that addresses all the questions. At this point, we need to provide some comments and feedback, particularly on the 4 items that were identified by Megan in her proposal, or in general. And with that, please put in the chat box that you're interested in providing comment and be called on. I'd ask you to try and keep it succinct because we only have about 50 minutes left and have a few more things to discuss. But with that, I open it to anyone that has comments. Well, I'll start. Okay. So I firmly believe that we need to explore other options for single family residences and townhomes. People tend to charge where they're at home at night when they bring their vehicles home from wherever they're driving. And we seem to not be treating our single family homes the same way we're treating our multifamily buildings. We need to find some way of making that more accessible when a house is built or a townhome, in particular. $350 incentive, in my opinion, is not very much towards getting anyone to do it. I have a neighbor that got a permit to build a new house in December of 2020, and the permit fees were $83,000 from the city of Issaquah. That was the permit and impact fees. A $350 incentive is not much to get someone to consider doing something like this. So it's about 0.4% of the overall permit cost. So I think when I asked this person, would they consider it for an incentive of $350, they said, are you crazy? And so that's my concern. So I think we're not achieving our goal of trying to get to reduce, the carbon emissions from vehicles and be more prepared for electric vehicles by not addressing that impact. That's why I asked the questions about legislation or other options. The second thing I'd like to point out is I'm concerned about the timing of this. The city's currently working on a significant review of the land use code, Title 18, which will be coming to the board. And I believe that piecemealing the land use code is what's got us to the mess in the land use code we're in today, which is, we kind of take a single agenda item and we move it forward, and we all have different concepts of that. And I think we really need to make sure we're doing the right thing for the multifamily homes, the townhomes, and everything. And it needs to be a comprehensive look at it, not just looking at electric vehicles and how they're charged, but other things we're going to ask of these buildings as we build them. And so when I looked at the work plan that Megan presented to us last week, she identified, or 2 weeks ago on the 13th, she identified that part of what we're looking at when we receive the land use code, and it's coming to the environmental board, is that we ensure new development demonstrates implementation of community sustainable development and climate goals. Well, clearly this is one piece of it, but there may be things that are higher priorities and get us more bangs for our buck if we ask the development community to do. So I feel like with this piecemealed approach, it would be very hard to come back and get another bite at the apple then. So I think that's my thought is, at least comments, is to consider our timing on this and making sure that we're thinking about this holistically as we do this major rewrite of the land use code. Those are my comments to date. I got to facilitate this meeting still, sorry. Anne, you're next.
I was partially wondering if the comments that I made before will count for now, or did I make them in the wrong place and so they won't count?
Of course they count. They count all the time.
Oh, okay, good. And then I probably don't have any more comments, but I do agree with Nancy that if we can get requirements for single homes, for builders for single homes, that would be preferable. It'd be good to know if new construction is already doing it or not, I guess. Thank you.
Is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
Everything cut out there for a minute. I'm sorry about that. Well, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the big picture here, and in terms of where are we headed as a society and all that. And think back, it wasn't that long ago when single-family residences did not have electricity and didn't have indoor plumbing. At least for an old person like me, it wasn't that long ago. So now we wouldn't think of that as should a low-income housing unit have a toilet or not? We don't argue about that. Well, of course it should have a toilet. Should it have a place to plug a refrigerator in? Well, of course. And it won't be too long in the future, in my opinion, when should we have a place to plug in an electric vehicle? Well, of course, that'll just be standard. we're not that far from that, in my opinion. It'll be like a generation from now. So that's where we're headed. Let's keep that in mind where we're headed. Of course, I could be wrong. I was wrong once before. But I think that's where we're headed. And so the details of how we get there, well, that's the messy part, and that's what we have to work through here. But I guess, well, so the bottom part of what I was saying there is that the distinction between low-income housing and single-family residence, I don't approve of that. I think that's wrong-headed. Their needs for transportation are the same, and the infrastructure for accomplishing that are the same, and it should be the same sort of requirement. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
I think I'm up next. Is that right? Sorry, I didn't hear anyone.
Jamie, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the two main things that come to mind for me. I mean, I think in an ideal state for all types of buildings, we would be finding a way to not only require but help subsidize the cost of these installations. I just worry for the long-term effects of putting extra costs on future buildings and then not necessarily having a funding source for existing buildings to have retrofits, like that you're basically introducing kind of structural inequity between like kind of vintages of construction that are going to be really hard to overcome without a plan. And I do wonder if the question around whether we should be providing incentives for single family is actually the better question we should be asking is like, why can't we provide incentives for all building types? And maybe it's more of a subsidy than a incentive when it's not a requirement. But that's really something that I would ask that we take a close look at, is finding a way, particularly for low income housing. I think that's where that becomes particularly important. Is I think it's a huge equity problem not to include it, but we need to find a way. I do think when Rishi's question earlier around, does it increase the cost to the end user of like someone, well, a developer is going to end up passing those costs through. So I think that's where finding a way to mitigate those costs is something that I think would be really important. But similarly, not doing that through just waiving the requirement entirely. So whether that's through subsidies or some way to shift the requirement from EVSC to maybe more emphasis on EV ready, which does provide a pretty significant cost savings. So, but yeah, that's really the heart of it, I think, is finding a way, because the actual per unit costs, I just threw together a quick Excel model on the per unit cost for all these different uses. They're not actually that different between single family, multifamily. It's more about it's if you could provide the same subsidy per housing unit, the cost coverage is actually quite similar. So that would be the big thing coming out of this is can we find another funding source or commit to funding other uses than just the single family.
Thank you. Rishi, you're now on.
Yep, I just wanted to express my concern in simply incentivizing single-family homes rather than requiring it. I think since retrofitting costs are approximately 2 to 8 times as expensive as making them EV ready at the time of construction, I think it's important to require EV readiness in all single-family homes and townhouses. Also, I did want to say that the non-residential buildings, as proposed in the ordinance, where they said that the number of EV-ready parking spaces should be only 10%. I think that's disproportionately affecting lower-income individuals who work multiple jobs on different job sites throughout the course of one day. They have to travel more, and so they need to ensure that they have a ability to charge their vehicles at the place of their work. So I think increasing the percentage of EV-ready parking spaces and potentially EVSE parking spaces in non-residential and parking spaces, surface parking spaces and parking garages should be considered.
Okay, next we have Danny.
Yeah, so I would echo Rishi's sense. I do think requirements would be preferable and ideal, although the process around that seems a little complicated. So I'd be interested to see what the lawyer says at the council study session. But also, I think, as Nancy was saying, it's really important to consider like a holistic approach. There are a lot of equity issues around this, especially with affordable housing, which is why, I agree. I think it should be a requirement just as it is in the other single family homes, because, yeah. And then also, I think I just reread the climate convening memo, and there is just so much like wonderful energy for Issaquah to be, a leader in pushing the community forward with climate, and I think this would be a really great step towards that. So I hope that we can figure out a way to make it a requirement.
Laura.
Thank you. Quick aside, I am so thrilled to be with a company of you guys. I'm really impressed by everyone's questions. It's really lovely to hear people say such thoughtful and diverse thoughts. I will get the least interesting thought out of the way, which is I agree that I think the affordable housing, any sort of waiver would be punitive and is ridiculous. The single family is more of a target. They're consuming the most, they produce the most emissions, and I think we need to look at ways to incentivize existing retrofits, even just giving a cash credit, just saying if you purchase an electric car, you get a credit from the city and you can do with it as you please on your house. That gets a lot of the paperwork out of the way. It just seems like it's a little bit simpler for if there aren't that many buildings going up. That's another option to consider. But I agree with everyone so far on that. I also agree about the concern about it being a piecemeal. I think there's interest in doing action, but the most successful action would be for people to not drive. So I fully support this. I think it's great, but I also want us to be careful about the potential and what it yields. And aside for zoning consideration, as we're doing like more planning updates, there's a potential for like, if you were to put this in a commercial space, so if your business had a charging station, most likely they're going to light it, and night lighting could be, have a bad impact on species migration. So just little things like that. There are going to be a lot of little detailed impacts where if they put a bright light in a parking lot, it's one more light in a parking lot that's consuming more electricity, but more so that's just disruptive. So I'd be interested in also not having an eyesore of like a bunch of charging stations everywhere. But that's just an aside of like things to keep on our radars. And then I also would be interested in being able to do incentivized solar or off-grid hookups of some sort down the line. I think there's a potential for us to do phasing so we don't have to force everyone to change right away as the technology is evolving, but the more we can get people off-grid, the better, or so it seems.
Thank you, Laura. Next, Anne, you have some comments?
I just wanted to have another comment on the transit-oriented development. You reminded me of what a builder had said during one of the city council meetings, and I just wanted to say that while I do agree with him that people living next to transit might be down to just one car, they might want to try to just have one car. It's getting easier and easier to just have one car and have it be electric. In fact, my husband and I are going to give it a try with the new Aria, which will be a 4-wheel drive and get like 300 miles. So the more charging stations we have, the better. And I would like to encourage stations for people who live next to the transit as well. Thanks.
Dawn, did you have a comment, or was that just telling us you got offline?
Oh, just letting you know that I'm back now. I lost my connection there for a couple minutes for some reason.
Well, I guess I'll Sorry, Don.
I mean, I'll enter a comment in on where I'm at with this. I would like to see the single families be included, but I understand the code challenges that you face. I would like to thank Megan and your staff for all the research you've done on this. Very well presented. The affordable housing waiver, I don't think that you should give a waiver for affordable housing. I think that they should include this in the build. I mean, this is part of what we're going to see in the future, and the demand for this is just going to increase. So this is just the first step, and I think these should be regulated into your codes as much as possible. Same with the transit-oriented development. I don't believe that that should be excluded from this. I do have one thing that I ask Megan, you and your staff to research a little bit, and that's on the existing housing and existing building structures. Is there a way to provide grant assistance to those people to provide electric vehicle charging? I don't like the idea of the city spending public funds to give them incentives or kickbacks. I think that's gifting of public funds. But I do believe that there's plenty of grants out there, and the city could probably help them figure out a way to navigate that.
Great. And I would like to offer just a little bit more feedback myself. One other comment I have, and that is that I too support putting in the EV infrastructure in affordable housing and the transit-oriented development. I think we need to try and develop policies and ordinances that are equitable for all, and that's one way of achieving it. And I would suggest that if there's pushback on the cost associated with those, to look at the parking requirements for both of those and see if there's some way to, I understand it's very expensive to build parking, and perhaps there is a way to reduce the parking requirements a little further so that you get more EV infrastructure along the way, but just for consideration. And I think there's one other question from Laura. And I just want to remind, before I go to you, I wanted to point out that we did get 6 comments from the public associated with our consideration of this, which I know you've all received. 5, they were from 5 different public members, and I know Megan has them available if the public is interested in seeing those comments and the feedback received to this board. And with that, I think Laura had one more comment.
I think Rishi had something first. I'll go and you can jump in. I can't tell if you're talking or not.
You could go and then I'll go after you.
Okay. Just 2 quick side comments. The 10% and then 30% for EV ready, it still seems low. I think, why would we, as an environmental board, why would we say that's sufficient? That means that, 60% of people can't charge their cars when they might need to. I don't know if that matters or not, but it seems rather arbitrary. And then also, I do think it's important to look at the EV ready being something that is not just built. I know in landscaping often will require people to put in trees, and then if the trees die, they met the requirement for putting them in and they don't maintain that vegetation. So if we require EV ready, there should be some consideration about what's the expectation long-term. When more people have cars, especially in affordable housing, they might not be interested in upgrading amenities.
Rishi, I'm sorry I missed you and your comment.
No worries, thank you. I just wanted to mention that a lot of the ordinance is just focused purely on new building construction and major retrofits, but I'm wondering if there's a potential to incentivize for existing residents so that in a similar program that was proposed for single family homes, but instead just for existing residents and residential buildings.
This is Megan Curtis Murphy. We haven't considered incentive programs for existing buildings at this time. The overall cost, as we talked about a little bit before, is a lot more expensive for existing buildings, 2 to 8 times more. So I think the focus is trying to make sure we're getting it into the buildings as they come online. I think looking at the possible grant assistance programs, as Don was mentioning. I think that would be helpful in trying to get that information out to existing buildings. Could be one way that the city could try to aid that.
Okay, I see that Jamie had a comment. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, I just had one comment on that, and I do think it's the same thing that Nancy said earlier, but I do wonder, as we look at towards us planning for a climate action plan, where we're going to have like a bunch of cost benefit analysis to do on like where do we invest funds and how do we make the biggest impact in the greatest way. So I do wonder if there's some piece there that would be helpful as we look at incentives and whatnot of like the broader context of like where else do we think we might need to make investments to really drive greenhouse gas emission changes. So that would just be one other thing that I think it'd be helpful to have that context and know and be able to have that holistic conversation, not only for land use, but I think also climate action plans, so we know where we're making investments and maybe this is the right place and we can try to really push for that. But that's one thing that I feel a little bit, it's a little bit hard for us, or at least me, to do that today.
And I would second that perspective, Jamie. Are the percentages we're looking for the right percentages? If you're looking at an overall climate action plan, is this the best use of it? That's just a question. Well, I think I'm going to close out the comments now and ask Megan. I'm going to put her on the spot to kind of summarize generally what feedback she's received from all of us and see if we need to clarify anything as this moves forward to the council. So Megan, you're on the spot.
All righty. And I said you can do that in advance. So I've been thinking about it some, but yes, let me give it a whirl. So I think we've heard a lot of great feedback here. So kind of looking at the pieces, I'll start with the pieces that the specific pieces we were asking for feedback on, and then come back to some of the other ones. About single family incentives. I hear a desire from the board of wanting to find some sort of path for doing that. If we're legally not able to do it through this ordinance, then what other things could be explored for that? I'm hearing similar comments to what we heard from PPC about just kind of concern about incentives for single family, that might not be the best use of the money, and hearing that from a few different angles, that maybe there's other climate actions that might be important for, or it's such a small percentage of the overall permit cost, maybe it's not really worth it there. So I am hearing some hesitation from the board in the single family incentive program. For affordable housing waivers, I'm hearing from the board that there's not interest in having that in the ordinance, primarily for equity reasons, and really wanting to make sure that everyone has equal access to this sort of transportation, have the benefits of EV ownership. That's something pretty consistent that I heard across the board. Also thinking about how we can make it easier to get to that infrastructure there, if that is a place for incentives. It seems like there might still be a question about that, but that might be an option. If not, trying to maybe look for grants for that, but just trying to find other ways. For the TOD projects, I think overall, again, similar PPC, I'm not hearing that these should necessarily have a waiver, that people who live in these projects, in these homes, are still going to have a vehicle, and electric vehicle is going to be a good option for many. It's not going to be an option for everyone, but that's why we have kind of these percentages about, we're not requiring all of the spots to be EV ready or EVSE, but it would provide that option, and people in that housing type should not be prohibited from that option. Let's see here. I'm hearing some thoughts about the timing of the ordinance. So we are doing the Title 18 overhaul this year and working on that. So wondering if if this should be considered at that time or if we should move it forward now as more a climate initiative. I'm hearing thoughts kind of on both sides of that. I wouldn't say that I've heard necessarily a consensus on either side, but definitely bringing up some questions about if we want to keep moving forward with this now as a climate initiative or folding it into that. I can hear you want for research on existing or grant assistance for existing buildings and wanting to try to find as much way as we can get EV infrastructure into them. Also thoughts about kind of, is this the right percentage? Should it be more? I think this is a starting point that we have through that big stakeholder process with the regional code collaboration. I think they looked at a lot of other ordinances and got a lot of feedback from people saying, is this the right amount? And these are the numbers that they came out based off of that. Not going too high for overall cost concerns, but not going over too low, since we are expecting to see more EVs coming down the line. And I think that's kind of some of the main pieces I have. I have a lot more written on my sheet, so don't think if I didn't mention your comment that that it hasn't been recorded. But that is the kind of the major pieces I'm hearing. Is there anything kind of big that I'm missing there that someone wants to chime in with?
Well, hearing nothing, I think we're going to move forward. I think Megan has some work to do to prepare this for the council and for the Planning Policy Commission in terms of how at least our comments get back to them. With that, I'm going to conclude our conversation about the electric vehicle charging ordinance. We aren't voting this time in terms of a position or a recommendation we're moving, just giving feedback, but likely we'll be providing a recommendation at a future date. So with that, we're going to move on to the next agenda topic, which is reports. Megan, do you have anything to report on?
I think the only other thing is this, I just want to mention, people brought up a lot of great feedback about kind of the climate plan and other ways that what else has the city done that we should be considering when we're thinking about the EV ordinance. And at the next meeting, we're going to be doing kind of a bigger conversation and presentation about the different actions, climate and sustainability actions the city has done. So I think that will really provide some useful context for moving forward with the other agenda items that we have. No other formal report.
Anybody else have anything to add as reports that they might be aware of that we should talk about? With that, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is other business and announcements. And I think Megan has some things to bring up there.
Yes. So I'd sent out an email to the board right before this meeting, but the city is hosting some community convenings on equity coming up. It's the Human Services Commission is hosting these. There'll be virtual convenings, of course, to discuss the role of residents in the city's equity initiatives and to brainstorm the creation of a new board or commission on equity. And I think our board members know something about creating a new board, as this is only our second meeting. And the Human Services Commission has asked for representatives from various boards to participate if they're able to. So I sent out information before to see if anyone is available or interested in that. I heard back from Nancy and Jamie that they would be available to attend that. So I think that would be great if they're able to go and participate and are able to come back and just provide a report out of what was discussed at those meetings at our next meeting. That would be great. If anyone else is interested, the first meeting is tomorrow and the second one is either on February 4th or 5th, February 4th. So it's a two-part series. Please let me know. We're happy to have other people go. We do need to, however, make sure we don't have a quorum of the board present. So that would be 5 or more people. So I'm just trying to track people. So just let me know if you are interested in going to that.
Great, thank you, Megan. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to add for the good of the order? With that, if there's no further business, I am going to state that the meeting is adjourned. With that, thank you, and you all have a very good night.